Welcome back to session number 2. Today, for this session, we are going to Colombia. So, how can the government of Colombia encourage the substitution of firewood with cleaner fuels in rural and peri-urban areas? All right, we have Jainaba, Paula, Stephanie, Raul. Take it away.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. My name is Raul Scorza, and these are my colleagues, Geneva Bi, Stephanie Scarlett, and Paula Salas Paredes, and we'll talk about creating a sustainable transition from firewood to LPG for cooking in Colombia. If you're wondering what LPG means, we'll talk about propane and propane accessories. For the agenda for today, we'll talk about the issue, our mandate that was given by the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Colombia, our approach towards the policy challenge, some underlying themes that we found throughout our research, and 3 main categories for our recommendations. The first one, and the most fundamental one, building stronger monitoring and evaluation, having mixed initiatives to address stove stacking, that's the second category, and finally, enhancing inclusion and accessibility, wrapping it all up with a visual aid for an action plan and a timeline. So why are we talking about this issue? Why are we talking about a transition from firewood to LPG? As you will see throughout the presentation, it's a multifaceted policy problem. Every year, there's millions of deaths linked to cooking with firewood indoors, and the World Health Organization estimates that approximately 4 million yearly deaths are linked to this practice. There's also a disproportionate burden on women, as gendered roles see them collect firewood most of the time, and they're also the ones who are expected to cook indoors, so they're most exposed to the negative externalities. All of these externalities, including the gender, the health outcomes, and also some environmental outcomes, amount to trillions of dollars lost around the world, approximately $2.4 trillion just last year. And the environmental impacts are not just limited to climate emissions that come from burning firewood. There's also issues around biodiversity loss and the alteration of the soil.
Okay, so the mandate of our policy lab research is to assist the Colombian Ministry of Mines and Energy, which we refer to as MINMINAS, to identify a sustainable transition from firewood to liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, for cooking in rural and peri-urban areas of Colombia. The goal of our policy lab is to produce a useful, balanced report that seeks to support the targeted beneficiaries. During the past several months, we have had meaningful engagement with our stakeholders, strong team dynamics, and an overall positive learning experience. The Firewood Substitution Plan, or the FSP, is one initiative within a wider multi-sector strategy in Colombia intended to achieve a sustainable energy transition away from firewood. MINMINAS is undertaking this project as mandated by the National Planning Unit, which we'll refer to as the DNP. The FSP pilot project aims to provide LPG energy access to 100,000 households of the low-income household across 4 departments or provinces by delivering LPG equipment and a yet-to-be-determined LPG subsidy. The FSP is not Colombia's first foray into sustainable energy transitions. Previous initiatives in the 1990s and the early 2000s, such as the Gas of the Countryside and the Efficient Stove Program, have contributed to Colombia's evolving understanding of sustainable transition programs. Despite their early success and uptake, these initiatives were ineffective in changing the cooking behaviors of the targeted populations once the interventions ended. The lack of a systemic and comprehensive ex-post evaluation for these initiatives made it impossible to evaluate their progress and identify mechanisms for ensuring post-intervention sustainability. Today, Colombia is better positioned for comprehensive, sustainable energy transition, bolstered by national policy commitment and capitalizing on global momentum for action through the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, specifically around guaranteeing affordable and clean energy, gender equality, and improved health and well-being. There's a particular policy window in February 2023 when MINMINAS is expected to present a plan to DNP for amending the pilot program prior to beginning implementation in February 2023. Our recommendations will inform MINMINA's plan.
Considering sustainable firewood transition is such a multifaceted policy challenge, narrowing the scope of our analysis was important. There are two main reasons for focusing on LPG as opposed to other forms of energy. The first involves a significant agreement among experts that LPG stoves are better at reducing health-relevant pollutants compared to improved biomass stoves. The second reason relates more pragmatically to the current direction of MINMINA's FSP. The FSP's guiding documents, as well as conversations with MINMINA's representatives, have emphasized LPG as the primary alternative fuel to cooking with firewood. In addition to our central research question, our research focused on 4 areas identified during our initial meetings with MINMINA's. These are LPG subsidies, environmental impacts of firewood usage, namely deforestation, the cultural barriers to firewood transition, and monitoring and evaluation of the FSP. We explored these themes in our research through an extensive literature review and numerous stakeholder and expert interviews. Before we continue, we just wanted to highlight 2 limitations to our research. The first limitation being that we are unable to directly consult the targeted beneficiaries of the FSP. And in addition, firewood transition touches on several different subject areas, including economic policy, environmental concerns, cultural norms, and social objectives. When discussing with experts, we observe their answers and propose policy solutions to be occasionally biased towards their area of research. We intentionally considered and attempted to mitigate these biases by weighing the multiple views of experts when developing our recommendations. As mentioned, switching from firewood to LPG will have impacts across many different policy dimensions. This implies that different policy instruments will affect these dimensions to varying degrees. For example, could the adoption of LPG bring about improved health benefits? If so, how can MINMINA's choose a subsidy mechanism that favors these outcomes? Would the same policies help prevent deforestation in Colombia? And how would women and Indigenous people be equitably included in this process? These questions allude to our first underlying theme of the presentation, which is timely choices and the costs of inaction. MINMINA's will have to make tough choices with the FSP's policy interventions, despite being cognizant that some of these options may perform less effectively in a particular policy space. It is evident that there's currently no silver bullet solution to sustainable firewood transition. The ability to make these choices in a manner that captures this complexity requires strong monitoring and evaluation. All of the insights and recommendations included in our presentation and report are rooted in having robust monitoring and evaluation systems. This will require meaningful discussions on how success is defined in relation to the FSP.
Organizational bureaucracies and competing policy priorities that are compounded by constrained resources can often result in policy makers becoming siloed into their specific policy arenas. The siloing affects how policymakers approach the challenges relating to sustainable LPG transitions, such as how to manage stove stacking and promote greater gender equity and Indigenous inclusion as wholly separate issues. If monitoring and evaluation is considered, it is often approached as an afterthought in many policy interventions, often just added to satisfy reporting requirements. We encourage MINMINA's to consider the monitoring and evaluation framework as a central tenet of any policy intervention that allows for us to better understand and address the challenges related to sustainable LPG transitions. With strong monitoring and evaluation, MINMINA's will be able to effectively translate their outcomes and lessons learned from the FSP pilot phase into a long-term sustainable energy transition.
So let's get to the specifics of our recommendations, and we'll start with building a stronger monitoring and evaluation framework. So how do we actually help the nearly 1.6 million households in Colombia that in 2017 cooked with firewood in their communities? So the first recommendation, and the one with the highest priority, is actually defining success in what the FSP understands as its primary goal. There's currently a lack of clarity around what Minminas envisions as success for this program, and we'll break it down for you. So there's 100,000 households that will be receiving stoves and a yet to be determined subsidy. Is the fact that these households get those stoves and the subsidy enough to qualify as success? Or are there other considerations too? Are the health outcomes being considered? Are the environmental dimensions being considered as well? In the current form of the FSP, there's no clarity in terms of these being included as actual success indicators. And furthermore, different government departments in the government of Colombia understand the FSP differently. There's different visions of what this initiative is supposed to do. For example, the Mining and Planning Energy Unit under the same ministry sees this as a potential to kind of help drive a national energy strategy, but there's no clarity in terms of how the outcomes will be translated into a national strategy. And also, Minminas is unsure how their outcomes are going to influence national decisions when it comes to energy transitions. So that's where monitoring and evaluation would come in. And this is why defining success at the very start is of utmost importance. We do acknowledge and recognize that there might be some operational dynamics, there might be inner politics, there might be some questions as to like wording in terms of what success is, but just the very start of sitting together, coming to an agreement of what success is, and getting that process going is of the utmost priority. One way to do that, one tool to kind of get the conversation going, is to develop an interdepartmental memorandum of understanding that clarifies project management and stakeholder engagement responsibilities, right? So being very intentional and specific about which government department will act on which end and who will be responsible for what. There is currently no framework like this under the current FSP, and so that is why we're suggesting this as a second recommendation. Now, we do understand that perhaps doing an MOU might be tricky when it comes to the length that this process would take, being stuck in the bureaucracy. But again, it's just a tool to get towards that conversation of what success is and who's doing what. And finally, such a multidimensional problem will involve different ministries and departments, because at the end of the day, the Ministry of Mines and Energy is responsible for mines and energy. There's only so much that they could do in terms of their policy purview. But if they want to incorporate all these other potential outcomes, health, environment, gender considerations, it will require other departments to come in, but not just to be involved, but also to provide their own expertise and staffing towards building a more holistic transition. And that is why we've included this as a second priority. So you could think of the first one as the highest priority and the highest policy recommendation that we recommend throughout all of these, and then the other two help build more interdepartmental collaboration.
Right, so if this section now moves into actually establishing a robust M&E framework, while M&E are complementary, for the purposes of our recommendations, we did split them up into two separate recommendations to be very clear that we're asking and recommending for two different processes to be implemented. So, to increase the monitoring capacity of the FSP, we recommend establishing an interdepartmental monitoring task force that includes Minmina's FSP project staff, Synergia data analytics, and additional departmental support across the issue dimensions such as health, environment, and indigenous issues. As Raul mentioned, we intend for this to be cross-departmental in order to facilitate the holistic approach to this monitoring, so that you're also capturing the climate, the environment, and indigenous issues. The aim of the task force is to develop and monitor FSP metrics that will make up the significant evaluation data. So this is in line with other regional transition programs. The Peru's FISA program has a dedicated monitoring analytics team embedded within their project staff. So this is very much in line with that. 1 second. And then in considering the metrics that will be measured in the FSP, we do recommend developing a specific metric for incorporating measures of LPG adoption rates for indigenous communities. This is more of an ongoing process recommendation. The intent of this recommendation is to create infrastructure that can carry throughout the FSP and serve as a model for future initiatives. The idea here is that we're not only improving Minmina's internal operating capacity, but it creates a blueprint for adapting it to other Minmina's projects and perhaps beyond the department as well. So this is obviously would be adapted as needed, but the hope is that it's a recommendation that has sticking power beyond just the FSP. This also would require significant funding and additional staff capacity, and we do acknowledge that. But as part of this being an investment in the FSP and in Minmina's own capacity, we do see it as a high beginning uptake risk with high reward over the long term, because you do get the benefit of being able to reuse these types of tools. So my next recommendation now moves towards evaluation capacity and implementation. So there's currently no robust evaluation plan. The FSP's guiding documents make no mention of who conducts an evaluation or how they intend to do it, although there are some clues as to the types of things they would hope to get out of an evaluation, including ongoing learning and, of course, seeing the impact of the FSP. We do know that Minminas is contracting a firm to carry out the implementation phase, but it is unclear if their contract will include M&E responsibilities as well. So the first type of evaluation that we are proposing is a process evaluation. With the FSP in its pilot phase, it is crucial to effectively monitor impacts throughout the lifetime of the project, and for project managers and stakeholders to learn as they go. This is crucial for adapting the project as it goes and for increasing institutional knowledge and capacity on project design, implementation, and evaluation. Process evaluations are less resource and time intensive than an impact evaluation. Therefore, we rank this as having a higher feasibility than the ensuing impact evaluation. We recommend that the FSP project manager incorporate the process use evaluation into their project timeline with periodic project status reports. We also recommend conducting an impact evaluation after the pilot period concludes. The length of time by which participants are monitored as part of an impact evaluation process is paramount for capturing a snapshot of whether the policy intervention succeeded in actually sustaining the behavioral change. If you just measure impact at the closing of the pilot program, you're only going to see who's using LPG right then and there. But if Minminas is actually curious about instituting a true behavior change, it helps to follow the participants along a specific timeline to see if the behavior was sustained after the intervention has ended. And that's how you define if your intervention was actually successful. So there is previous evidence from the Colombian context that stress that the energy transition projects should be conceived with a time frame of about 5 to 10 years post the intervention. However, we are recommending that the impact evaluation be conducted with follow-up surveys and participant interviews scheduled in yearly intervals for up to 3 years after receiving the intervention. The reason why we're taking this mediated approach is recognizing that the pilot phase is a pilot phase. It's an opportunity for ongoing learning and growth, and recognizing that the ball's kind of already rolling here. We're coming up onto to a very particular policy window where implementation needs to begin. And the idea of stretching out impact evaluation too long might hinder our ability to get those conclusive outcome results. So recognizing that financing multi-year impact evaluations in addition to ongoing process and use evaluations is resource and time intensive, we strongly believe and affirm that these are necessary for introducing clear purpose, providing data-based evidence to inform policymakers, and most importantly, for measuring if this pilot program is having its intended benefit for Colombians who need the intervention the most. Additionally, I do want to talk about the next recommendation, which is in regard to deforestation. Now, this was something that our sponsor, Mina, specifically asked us to look into. They wanted to know about the linkages between firewood transition and deforestation as an environmental indicator on success. Our research found that forest degradation is actually a bigger issue than deforestation, and by deforestation, we are referring to a permanent change of forested landscape and land use, such as is done through agriculture or mining, versus degradation, which is the loss of long-term potential benefits of a forest, which include carbon sequestration, biodiversity erosion reduction. Our key insight here is that only 30% of personal firewood consumption is unsustainable, and that across the Latin American region, this is actually not as big an issue. Latin America actually has the lowest percentage use of deforestation worldwide. So without having Colombia-specific data available, we would expect that the FSP is likely to have minimal effects on deforestation rates in Colombia. Therefore, we recommend that deforestation be excluded as a policy mechanism for reducing, for assessing environmental impacts within the FSP, and that Minas should not spend resources monitoring this.
All right. So our next set of recommendations address stove stacking. So the phenomenon of stove stacking occurs when there are multiple fuel and stove combinations within the same household. Just as in our own kitchens, we may have a gas range, an electric microwave, a convection oven, and now an air fryer. Households that adopt modern cooking technology often retain multiple cooking options. I'm going to take a wild guess and take it that you are not going to throw out your oven just because you bought a new air fryer. Stove stacking in the context of our policy challenge involves the concurrent use of firewood for cooking along with LPG. And unlike an air fryer, households that continue to use firewood, even if its occurrence is reduced, are still exposed to household air pollutants that can have negative health outcomes. This is why addressing stove stacking is so important. The first recommendation addresses affordability as one of the main barriers to adopting LPG and reducing stove stacking. This can be addressed by the subsidy. However, there is no consensus on what the ideal subsidy percentage is among experts. Some research says that a subsidy above 50% will lead to the greatest adoption. What is considered affordable will vary widely across regions and be dependent on many socioeconomic considerations. This is why it is crucial to identify the subsidy percentage that would lead to the highest level of LPG adoption through regional research. This can be done through variable subsidy studies or randomized controlled trials, although we do acknowledge that RCTs can be expensive. We recognize that Minas does not directly have the ability to raise the amount of the subsidy, as it is not within their jurisdiction. However, this subsidy research can be leveraged in conversations with the National Planning Department next February. This recommendation further highlights the importance of monitoring and evaluation. Research could start once implementation begins, as the pilot is a timely opportunity to understand affordability before expanding the program to more households. This is related to our second recommendation that also has the ability to address the impacts of stove stacking. In the presence of a subsidy, a meta-analysis in the literature showed that in more than 10 jurisdictions who had a subsidy, there were still some forms of stacking present. It is virtually impossible to get rid of stove stacking. Some communities in Colombia will have a greater affinity for firewood for cooking because they live near forests that are accessible for a collection. Forest availability can be a barrier to LPG transition, as households are more likely to continue using firewood as it is more accessible and economical compared to subsidized LPG. In this case, the FSP may consider developing a cleaner stacking option in which LPG stoves are used concurrently with improved biomass stoves. This recommendation may have trade-offs, as health outcomes may be dampened by the use of improved biomass stoves. This is why defining what success means in regard to the FSP is our highest priority. This brings me to our third recommendation for stacking. Research finds that transitions away from firewood can often exclude the needs of women and Indigenous people. Indigenous communities have distinct lifestyles in which their livelihoods are connected with nature. Minas should consider developing partnerships with Indigenous communities to respond to their unique relationship to firewood. Clean stacking and improved biomass stoves could be a way to respect this relationship while trying to achieve the outcomes of transition. In addition, whether it's LPG or LPG and improved biomass stoves, Indigenous communities need the information on usage, safety, and health impacts of both transition mechanisms. The final recommendation that addresses stove stacking returns to the notion that in areas of high forest availability, there will be less LPG adoption and sustained use. In this case, there are two sides to the transition coin. So one side is that we're incentivizing the use of LPG, which can be done through the subsidy. The other side is to disincentivize the use of firewood. This can be achieved through a variety of market mechanisms. There's a few laid out in the report, but an example of one of these would be an LPG program that is coupled with a carbon credit scheme that reduces deforestation, such as the UN's Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation program, which is also called the REDD+ program. Which has been proven to be effective as it puts a price on firewood and incentivizes individuals to use LPG. It's important to note that the objective of this recommendation is to increase the LPG adoption and uptake, rather than decrease the environmental impacts of personal firewood collection, although there may be secondary environmental outcomes of this policy. If market mechanisms are required, implementation would take place after the pilot is completed in 2026. A post-pilot evaluation would identify regions that have both low LPG adoption and areas of high forest availability. Minas may work with the Ministry of Environment in Colombia to implement market mechanisms, as they are already involved in the global carbon market through various initiatives, including being a partner to the REDD+ program.
The final recommendation focuses on enhancing inclusiveness and accessibility for women and Indigenous communities. We recommend that Minas, in partnership with MINSA and LPG distributors, conduct dedicated communications campaigns that address the needs of women and Indigenous peoples by connecting LPG use to everyday life. This is premised on the key finding that communication that is focused exclusively on the health component of firewood transition is insufficient. These campaigns should emphasize the benefits of using LPG in daily life. This can be achieved by going beyond the health benefits and considering how LPG can help consumers save more time. These initiatives are crucial for enabling families to spend more time together, as well as for assisting women in realizing their socio-economic benefits of spending time outside of the home. This recommendation has a medium priority and can be executed after the implementation stage. It may be conducted through appropriate media platforms such as newspapers, television, and radio. Furthermore, to boost accessibility, these advertisements should be presented in local languages and illustrated for people who cannot read or write. To improve information availability, these efforts should focus on public spaces. Also, these communication campaigns should be developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples through the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia to ensure that their viewpoints are heard and to determine how to establish communication initiatives in a culturally appropriate manner. Finally, these campaigns would also help to enhance the private sector's marketing efforts to encourage the use of LPG and purchase as used in other market transformation programs.
Right, so now moving into our conclusion here. So here you see a visual representation of our recommendations along a short, medium, and long-term continuum for implementation. You see as well here a visual representation of all the different stakeholders and partners that we think have a role to play in improving the FSP, and as well as the timelines for how we think we should do this. So to be very brief, in our conclusion, this is a multidimensional problem that requires a multidimensional outlook. And the strong M&E framework is absolutely crucial. If you've been keeping track of how many times we've been saying M&E, 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 it's clear that we think this is a really important thing to invest in and to devote significant capacity to. This can help us engage with complex components such as reducing stove stacking and promoting cleaner stove stacking, and to promote the genuine inclusion of women and indigenous peoples. And I want to thank you for your time, and I hope that this has fired you up about our issue, and feel free to gas us up.
All right, thank you. Thank you for firing up the audience. I love how a problem that at the beginning seems like a simple problem ends up not being simple at all. And I'd like to also know how many of you have air fryers. Really? Okay, I don't have an air fryer. All right. What's an air fryer? Is that what you said? Okay, I'm gonna assume that your answer is no. All right. All right, thank you, team. So are you first up, Natalie?
I can be, but I certainly want to say that we have 26 people online, of which we have many members from Minminas that are online with us right now. So after the judges ask their questions, we're going to pass it over to our sponsors at Minminas. I see Carlos, I see Diego, I see Sandra, I see Sarah, and I see a few others as well. So we're going to ask our sponsors to raise your hand and prepare to turn on your video and your mic when we turn the mic over to you. So that'll be in just a few minutes.
Okay, perfect. So it may be that all questions and answers have to be shorter than they otherwise would be.
You may not have time for your questions.
Oh my goodness. Mine was about where do you get an air fryer. But okay, who's first? Who's first from the judges?
I'll go first. Nadidi will go second, and Leslie has made a special request to go last. So I am curious to see what questions she has. So I have two questions. My first question is around the recommendation around biomass, and specifically around the health risks. So you mentioned that essentially we should be promoting FSP not so much for deforestation, but because it has health impacts, particularly to women. So my first question is it different with biomass, and why? My second question is around something you mentioned in your brief, and it was around the voucher system in Peru. And you mentioned that it was ineffective. And so I wondered why it was ineffective, and how could Peru have better implemented it for it to be effective? Because I thought it was a really logical thing where people would get their propane cylinder and they would just swap it out. And I love that swapping system. I thought it was simple and clear. So I was curious as to why it was ineffective and what could have been done to make it effective. So those are my two questions.
I'll take both, just because it touches on stuff that I helped research. So the first one about improved biomass stoves, and this is why defining success is such a key thing for our policy recommendations. So essentially, the latest research shows that improved biomass stoves just do not lead to the health outcomes that you would see with LPG stoves. The reasons being, perhaps people don't operate them as they're intended to. Perhaps the design of the stove is not good enough to limit the pollutants that come up, right? So that's kind of like where the research is. But this is why like defining like what you mean by these are the outcomes we want is so important, right? Because you'd be like, we're trying to make the best out of a essentially like difficult situation, right? Like where you are not going to necessarily eliminate stacking completely. So if people are going to use firewood, could they use it in a way that perhaps mitigates those health outcomes? being cognizant of the fact that that might not happen, right? So where do you dedicate your efforts? Do you do it in terms of, okay, we only care about energy access. That's what the success is defined for us. So you might need to sacrifice, the issues around health. Or, do you try to do a cleaner stack? We didn't talk about it in the presentation, but obviously kind of like the cleanest stack is electricity, right? And there is a big push towards, okay, there's no combustion in electricity, so there's virtually no health impacts. But even that, it has a ton of challenges and barriers in terms of cost, because we're talking about rural households, right? How do you get rural households that are off the grid, that are very far away, onto an electric system? You could perhaps do like some things like solar, but even that, you have problems around energy storage, about demand side management. So you run into all these issues, right? So really, we're not in a position to be like, this is what you should do, or this is what you should do. We're kind of trying to tell Minminas, or encourage Minminas to think, okay, these are all the complexities. Where do you want to tackle or to focus on? That's kind of like our approach. In terms of the voucher system, so the voucher system is effective in Peru, but there's some kind of trade-offs in how it operates. So essentially, people before, like in the original version of the voucher system, people would receive in the mail on their electricity bill a little like code that you would take to the LPG distributor. They would scan it. They would make sure you match the criteria, that you were under a certain socioeconomic level, and you get your subsidized LPG. There's two big assumptions there, right? The first one is that you're hooked up to electricity, so that you have like an electric kind of provider that sends you, okay, this is on your electricity bill. And the second is that you have a mailbox that they can reach you through kind of courier, right? So they've adapted a little bit to kind of like now, I think you're able to do it through text. You get your code through text, but it still is only relying on people that are on the grid. The reason why they do this is because Peru has a very good electricity penetration. So there's a lot of kind of like communities that are electrified, but you're not technically capturing everyone. And perhaps the most vulnerable households, who are the ones that don't have access to electricity, right? So that's where the complexity is.
Okay, Didi.
Thank you so much. This is not an easy project, so I commend your tenacity. I have a question around the fundamental business model. So I saw a lot of emphasis around M&E, but my question is, given all the climate shifts and all the possible interventions, is a focus on clean cook stoves and even the strategy the right one from a political perspective? And have you seen that there's going to be political will to push through, given all the other competing interventions and approaches to address climate change? In many of our countries, LPG has been, this FSP has been touted, and then it's like a fad. So what is your sense? I mean, we have the clients and the sponsor online. Maybe at some point they should address that. But what is your sense as to where this stacks up in the list of interventions that they're considering and pushing and putting money behind? And how can you, and do you feel like this is really the right emphasis that they should be placing, and the most, I don't want to use Andrew's term about silver bullets and Swiss Army knives, but do you think that this is the right approach for these communities? Thank you.
So I believe our team truly thinks that LPG is kind of the first course of action when transitioning from firewood. It was kind of a unanimous agreement among the experts that we spoke with and in the literature that we wrote that it's very difficult to transition from firewood to other forms of cleaner energy, such as electricity. So that's why LPG is such a is commonly used, and some countries we've noticed that they have already undergone transition many years ago, and now they're moving towards electrification. But there's this thing described in the literature called the energy ladder, and we move along this energy ladder, and you can start with firewood, and then you move to something a bit cleaner. And we mentioned in our presentation that LPG is one of the one of the best sources of energy, although it is carbon emitting, to reduce negative health outcomes of which is one of the things that they are trying to address with this policy. So I do think that LPG is a very solid policy, and I think they'll see success with the FSP.
Leslie.
Okay, so what a happy day for me, right? I'm seeing evaluation all around. Holy moly. Okay, so this question might come as a surprise to you, and I have two, which is also probably not surprising by this point. This one revolves around you making M&E such a high priority, right? And so, of course, I'd love to see this, right? I love the idea that finally M&E is getting, on the stage, and we're kind of seeing the potential it holds for helping people to think through how do you develop a policy, how do you develop a program, right? Here's the conundrum that evaluators face, though, is that we get really excited about this and other people don't. Right? Like, by and large, they're excited about their programs. They're excited about getting that underway. And they're not wrong. Like, things need to move. What happens in M&E sometimes, and I suspect with some of what you've proposed here, given all the different parties, is that this could get stalled out on the M&E front. Or you could have slow times. So how do you propose to balance all these different needs and not have people just kind of get tired out of M&E, but kind of keep their excitement up in, for the programming and the M&E aspects?
So I think to the first point of your question about why M&E is such a big emphasis, I want to take a minute to elaborate on how we arrived at this being our central focus. So through our initial conversations with the sponsor in December, it seemed like a big emphasis was on the LPG subsidies, and a lot of interest as well on deforestation. And if you would have asked me, if we would have had to submit the assignment then, I would have said that would have probably been a big focus. But as we started getting deeper into the complexities of this multidimensional policy challenge, and in conversing with expert stakeholders, we started to see a pattern emerging of where if you don't have clear outcomes, clear policy goals, clear metrics, you're kind of running a ship without rudders, essentially. And by that I mean that the ship is going and it's going to go with the flow of the ocean, but you don't have much in the way of steering it. So M&E really became a focus for us as a real method to underpin how to improve the FSP, and the visual aid I used of the umbrella was really kind of trying to drive home that message of the M&E can help tackle all these other issues that you care about. Now, to your second question about, how do we maintain momentum? I think we've been pleasantly surprised by our sponsor in conversations about just their interest in the issue, and in their interest in trying to figure out how to make it feasible, right? It is expensive. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be intensive. But they seem willing to learn a little bit more about how to implement this. They asked for recommendations on what type of skills an evaluator should have. So in our appendix, we included those types of skills. We also included additional resources of like the utilization-focused evaluation checklist from Patton. We included. Yeah, and so we did take time to make sure that we made it at least as accessible as possible, so that when they are coming together and trying to realize, okay, what do we do first, and what can we afford to do first, they can look at our recommendations and see that this is part of a bigger bigger process. We don't expect an M&E framework to spring up overnight, but the decision for what to do and how much to implement it will be ultimately up to the sponsor, hopefully with the information that we've provided for them.
Great, thanks. I think that's a good answer. And I don't want to take up too much time because I know other people have questions. Just in response to that, though, one thing I'd encourage folks to think about is to include something called developmental evaluation so that you can start moving the program as you are moving the evaluation as kind of at the same time. That might help. The other question I have is you have this conversation about outcomes at the very beginning, and I like that. I'm curious, though, what your plan is for identifying unanticipated outcomes, both positive and negative, through this M&E system.
So with the combination of process use evaluation through the length of the FSP and then an impact evaluation afterwards, the hope is that the real-time information that's coming in through the process use will be utilized by the FSP project managers to allow them to kind of tweak the project in real time. So if you're referring to unintended outcomes, like as it's happening, like say, like for example, like in the implementation, they suddenly realize that, you know, they're having trouble finding people who want to work as the interviewers or something. You know, we've talked a lot about in class about how those things can happen. And usually the best way to do that is just to continue to reassess your timeline. So, and hold that space and through the process use evaluation for checking in with each other and the different components to see how essentially do you address those unintended outcomes. In the impact evaluation side, unintended outcomes I don't see them as a negative thing because that is part of learning, right? And given that this is a pilot program, a big outcome is that learning. So I think it's incredibly, if there are unintended outcomes, those are lessons learned for improving for further iterations of the FSB. And maybe my hope is that in greater internal coordination within this robust M&E framework, it also informs how the broader Colombian sustainable energy transition moves forward. Because as we've seen, this is not Colombia's first foray into this type of work. And with each iteration of policy intervention, we see an evolution in their thinking and understanding of this. So I think that's a very positive sign. And we should continue to foster that by continuing to create channels through M&E that can help them continue to learn.
So real quick before, because it's a nice transition to the sponsor questions. We are very happy to see the sponsors say that they looked at this as a learning opportunity. So they themselves already think like, okay, this is a chance to learn. And we're hoping that that's a signal to kind of be like, okay, this will help with the unintended consequences or things that go, come along, is that they already identify this as a learning process.
Okay, we're going to take it over to the sponsors. Jonathan, I don't know if my microphone is working because it's flashing yellow and red at me.
Oh, just click it once so the flashing stops.
And then it's just red.
Yeah, that should be okay.
That's good. Red is good. Red is good. All right.
For the next 10 minutes, it's good. After that, it's not good.
Okay, Natalie, over to the sponsors.
So we have several sponsors online. Carlos is ready to go first, and then we hope to hear comments or questions from some of the other sponsors online, and after that we will move on to the general audience. So Carlos, take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask it. Sorry, some audio problems. If Sarah wants to go first, or do you want me to start?
Go ahead, Carlos.
Okay. Well, first, I would like just to thank you all. And this has been, as Raul said, an experience for us to learn. And as you have said, this is a pilot project. So what we are looking forward is to understand better the subjects of our public policy, but also the opportunities that we can improve our public policy. I believe in the first and the third parts of your proposals, we have already taken a very clear note of what opportunities of improvement we have. And I would like to stop in the second part. And I would like to focus on something that we have put a lot of focus on it. And it is regarding reducing deforestation. And as you have explained to us, that this public policy, sorry, just gonna take away my headphone because I have another, there, sorry, I couldn't hear you correctly. So the first thing that I wanted to take into consideration, just allow me, sorry, I have a problem with my audio here. There, I'm sorry. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, you have told us that one proposal is not to do this monitoring regarding deforestation, and I just wanted to ask if this proposal is based upon the cost benefit that it might bring to us. And why am I asking this? Environment also has certain projects regarding the use of not LPG but efficient stoves, and the main objective of environment is a focus on deforestation. And whether it's not the same focus and the same policy, we do believe that one opportunity of improvement would be based, especially in considering the monitoring and the interdepartmental cooperation between Ministry of Environment and Mines, could be the focus of those two objectives between the two ministries. So I wanted to know if, considering that opportunity that we might have in the future of involving resources of environment and mines to focus on this global policy, we should also be thinking on eliminating the focus on monitoring deforestation. We understand that maybe, considering the budgetary issues, this might not be an efficient way for guaranteeing our monitoring. But if we think a bit of in the future and the opportunity that we might have in environment, we would like to know if this recommendation is based right now upon a basis of cost benefit for eliminating this deforestation aspect of monitoring. And I would just like to make a comment. You have said that Latin America matters regarding deforestation are low regarding the global aspects, but in Colombia, one of the main issues that conduct to climate change regarding the Colombian aporte, I don't know if that's the correct word, is the change on land use, and is especially related with the deforestation. So maybe considering the Colombian aspect and the Colombian, climate change approach, we might want to reconsider that main aspect regarding our public policy. That is the first question. I'm sorry if it was too long. And the second one was regarding the development of market mechanisms with high forest availability. And I wanted to understand if that proposal could be understood as an additional aspect besides the LPG stoves policy. And why I'm asking this, because I understood that you mentioned market mechanisms as global carbon markets or RED Plus market mechanisms. So I wanted to understand, how could you, connect the policy of the LPG with these market mechanisms, or how are you seeing this proposal as an additional matter that we could take into consideration for the improvement of our public policy? So besides that, I just wanted to thank you all.
Great, thank you, Carlos, for those questions. Those were great questions. So I'll address the first one and the second one, but to start off with, the purpose of this recommendation is not to say that there is that personal firewood collection does not cause deforestation or forest degradation. We are simply saying that a lot of policies very much overstate that impact. Globally, 30% of personal firewood collection for cooking is unsustainable, so causing deforestation. And in that context, Latin America has one of the lowest rates not for deforestation, but for deforestation caused by personal firewood collection. So that's the distinction there. In addition to this, there's also, when you collect collect firewood for cooking, you can also, there's forest degradation, which we have found is very difficult to measure compared to deforestation. Even within the REDD+ program, they have difficulty measuring forest degradation. So those would be aspects such as tree species diversity, soil composition. That is just not within it's very expensive to measure, and it's not within kind of the resources. When we looked at the broader M&E framework and we looked at the resources available, we wanted to consider, exactly as you said, what would be the best cost benefit. And we thought if you spent your resources on measuring deforestation as a result of this policy, you're going to see you will likely see very minimal results. So I hope that answers that first question. And then the second question in regards to market mechanisms, and we can talk specifically about the REDD+ program. So this works alongside an LPG subsidy. They work in kind of unison in the sense that there's a case study from India that had an LPG subsidy along with a carbon credit program, and they were actually able to reduce the amount of subsidy that they gave to households because they had this carbon credit program. Because firewood now had a price, the price elasticity of the LPG changed for households. So that's why these two policies work very well together. And at the same time, you can also see environmental benefits from this. And considering, we thought this was a very helpful policy because considering Colombia is already a partner of the REDD program and the Ministry of Environment's leading that. And in our report, we said that the Ministry of Environment would lead this recommendation because they are already involved in that carbon credit market. We think that this is a very feasible policy to implement in the future, and it kind of works with what you were saying, how you can start working together with the Ministry of Environment to achieve synergistic goals. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Natalie, do we have anybody else from
We do.
out there?
Sarah is next from
Okay.
Minas.
Hello, good morning. I don't have a question. I just want to share a comment that the teamwork already knows. First of all, I want to thank the teamwork for this work and this policy lab. As I told them in a previous session, like the first session that we had, although we are starting with a pilot, as the name says, it is a pilot, and the idea is to be able to come up with a program that is useful and achieve the objectives that we already have set for ourselves and for our country. And this work is a great input for us in the ministry. But I have to say that there are some recommendations that can be easily implemented, but there are others that will take more time so we can implement. And there will be like a small group that will be more difficult to achieve because we need a law, as I told them, and we can get this kind of law, we need to go to the Colombian Congress. So I think that the teamwork is know about us, but know about this, because we have this session where we explain how we can like increase the percent of subsidies. But I think that it's a great work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. We're
Okay.
going to move on to Sandra from Minminas as well.
Hi, thank you. Just to reiterate the message behind Sarah's intervention, and we're very grateful for your hard work and for also being receptive to our comments and to our feedback. We appreciate it a lot. We will review this set of recommendations document, and hopefully we'll be able to implement a few of them in the near future. So thank you so much.
And maybe one final question. So Nee shared a question. So Dr. Nee Addy was the coach for the team, shared a question for you, which is, while your study was focused on the Colombian government, what aspects of your findings do you think would be most relevant to governments and businesses and other stakeholders in other countries?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Nee. So some of the other, one of the recommendations that we came up with was to create designated or dedicated communication campaigns for rural and peri-urban areas in order to increase the uptake of LPG. And so because although it's a very expensive campaign, which requires a lot of resources, making it a small scale one in rural and peri-urban areas around the world in the global south, I think that it would be applicable, and also it would also increase the information accessibility and availability for people who don't have access.
That's it for our online questions. Thank you for those of you who were online that shared their questions.
Okay, then let's open it up to questions from the audience. We only have a few minutes before, but we can eat into the lunchtime just a little bit. Juan. Oh, we need a microphone. Yep.
You're so excited to say that.
I just had a quick question about the broad context, the political context. So, and this may fall a bit, it's not exactly within the timeline of your policy lab experience, but recently, a few weeks ago, Gustavo Petro was elected president, and this is the first left-wing government in Colombia's history. I was wondering if this new government, if you think that this is going to affect the rollout of your recommendations in any way, and how so?
Good question.
I can tackle that. And again, Minas is on the line, so they probably know best what might happen. But this is just our kind of sense of how it could impact. So I think some of the news that has been coming out is, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, his efforts towards decarbonizing, right? So like clean energy, sustainable energy. And so that transition towards perhaps electric solutions. But when you look at it in terms of the cooking with firewood conundrum, right? That's where kind of the complexity lies. So perhaps there could be measures to kind of have that cleanest stack that we talked about, right? So combining electric stoves or equipment with LPG or with improved biomass stoves, considering all the trade-offs that you would have to make, right? So there perhaps might be more of an emphasis on, we want to move people towards electric. And don't get us wrong, like that's eventually what may happen. But that's the trade-off, right? It's going to take time to get people to, the electric grid, to the electricity. And in that meantime, they're going to still be cooking with firewood, right? And they're going to still be exposed to all these pollutants. So what happens in the meantime? That really is kind of like the key question. And that's where the kind of, okay, maybe the stacking that's cleaner might be a better option.
Natalie has just signaled to me that I'm allowed to ask a question.
Okay.
Okay, so my question is about how this policy, not about the details about it at all, but how this policy package is communicated and how it's kind of sold to the public. So my understanding, there's a lesson, I think, from Ontario. My understanding about the single largest policy action that reduced greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario was the closure of Ontario's coal-fired electricity plants. That happened about 15 years ago. That happened 7 years before a comprehensive provincial climate plan. It happened 10 years before a comprehensive federal climate plan. So it happened before all of that. It was driven largely by concern about climate change, but the climate activists actually changed their tack in the last few years before success, and they started selling it as a health policy. They started selling it as a health policy because of the air particulates caused by burning coal. And what they learned is that when you sold the closure of coal-fired plants as a health policy, it was more successful. It resonated more than as a climate policy. Now, maybe in 2022, we're in a different time and climate just resonates more. But I just wonder whether, because this is clearly about a health issue as well, about the particulates. It's not just about the particulates outside of the stack or the chimney, but inside the house. So it's a very local health issue, right? And I guess my question is there any reason to believe that this entire policy framework might actually get more traction if it were sold as health policy rather than environmental policy?
Okay, thank you for your question. So one of the so during our research during our research and like consultations with stakeholders, one of the things that they mentioned to us was that health messaging that relied solely on the health aspect or a health component. So to say, for example, in the Firewood case, okay, it's damaging for your lungs, it leads to low birth weights, was ineffective, right? And this is, and so what they recommended instead was to link it to daily life, right? Because chances are a lot of people already know know a little bit about the health implications of whichever thing that you're referring to. But then they, but then they're not very, they're not clear on how it can be linked to their daily life. So once you make those linkages, it's more effective, and it allows them to, I guess it makes it a bit more relatable, and hence why they're able to uptake whichever technology that you are presenting to them. And so if you look at the other health messaging campaigns that have been around, like smoking kills, it hasn't really stopped a lot of people from smoking, versus saying, oh, if you stop smoking, it could allow you to, I don't know, spend more time with your family or live long, stuff like that. That's what we're referring to.
Can I do like
Yep.
a quick little yes, and also from a monitoring evaluation perspective, trying to measure, capture as a metric the health impacts is really expensive and really difficult to singularly pinpoint to just the household indoor air pollution. So it's therefore really hard to track the adverse health outcomes specifically to this. It's something that we're observing, but it's something that's really hard to actually measure. So that also makes messaging it hard because you don't have data.
Okay. John, I'm going to give you the last word just because your hand is up and I saw it up a few minutes ago.
Sure. Comment on the last thing. People are more receptive to health, safety, and environmental messages at higher income levels. So in a more affluent society, you'll get farther with that messaging. I want to just quickly question the attention that was paid to reducing stacking. Because in all the work I've done in energy policy, which is a lot, stacking of technologies is vital to resilience. So you keep cash and paper receipts for when your payment system and your electricity don't work, right?
Last week.
And like last week. And you keep landlines. You don't get rid of all your landlines because you really need them when the mobile phones don't work. And, cash is a little bit dirty and it's inefficient to operate. But boy, do you ever need it when, otherwise you close down, whereas you can still run your restaurant if you have a cash system. So aren't you concerned that all this attention to destacking? I mean, if I were a poor household in Colombia, would I trust that the LPG subsidy was going to last forever? Would I trust that the LPG supply was always going to be there? Or would I keep my firewood option? I wouldn't. I'd have to have a whole generation of kids get used to LPG always being there before I.
But there's a difference between keeping your firewood option and using it on a regular basis. Right. So you can stack and still have one that's inactive.
Yeah.
You could do that, and that would then help the problem. So I actually.
Anyway, aren't you concerned about the impact on resilience?
Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah. Because that's kind of the logic behind the cleanest stack, right? And we're saying like, okay, if you're going to stack, can you do it in a way that is the least harmful in terms of health outcomes, right? So that's why we're saying, okay, you could do the improved biomass stoves with an LPG stove, with like an electric stove. But again, that's where you have to like choose, right? Because we know when we've seen that improved biomass stoves just don't lead to the health outcomes, right? Like there's a lot of research that shows that. So kind of like that's where the trade-off is, right? Like you have to figure out what is kind of aligned with what you think is good or good enough in a way, and how do you get there, right? And to your point, like, I mean, there's a lot of research that shows, for example, that people cook dishes that need firewood because it's slow cooking, right? Usually, like, when it's, like, large families, you do, like, I don't know, like a pot roast or whatever that takes longer to cook, and that's very difficult to do with an LPG stove, right? So there's those considerations, too. And so the idea is kind of like, how do you tackle this complex situation in the cleanest way possible? I'll for sure give you the point that, perhaps in the past, people were really obsessed with, we have to get rid of stacking. It has to be LPG 100%. But now people are coming around to the idea of like, well, you're right. Like, I mean, we're not necessarily going to get rid of stacking 100%, but how can we do it in the cleanest way possible? That's a good question.
Okay, the mention of slow cooking, slow pot roast. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a little peckish on that. So let's wrap this up. Thank you very much, team. Well done.